really pleased that we've got a fantastic speaker to finish off this semester with. Not the end of the semester for you though, of course. It's Steve Swan. Steve has got a vast amount of experience in his career as a producer for the BBC, as a journalist, broadcasting.
Yeah, some, yep.
The lot. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Steve.
Thank you very much, everybody. It's nice to see you. What I was going to do was play a short, something about 5 minutes, film, just to give you a flavour of some of the things that I've worked on in my career. I've worked at the BBC for 20 years, gulp now, as a producer, reporter, done lots of different things. But I was hoping just to play this, then you can have a look at it, and then really I don't want to do a lecture. I just wanted to answer any questions that you might like to ask about journalism, about working for the BBC, whatever really, or how, you know, if there are sort of things that you see in the 5-minute film that raise questions. I'll play it, then you get a sense of it, and then perhaps I'll just fill in a few gaps afterwards. I'll just talk about, for a few minutes, just about my career, how I started and what I do now. And then really this is just an opportunity for you guys to ask whatever questions you like, really. So it will kind of depend on you what we really talk about, but it may be an opportunity if some of you are thinking of pursuing a career in journalism, just to ask questions of someone who's, you know, who is a journalist. So this is the short film. Hopefully it makes sense. I'm afraid I did knock it together quite quickly, so it's probably not quite as polished as the things that you guys work on, but hopefully it'll give you a few ideas. Okay. Recommended settings.
Bottom right
Finish. Okay, let's get that full screen. Is that full screen up there? No. Whoops. Let's go back to that again. How do I get that full screen? Yeah. Can you play it through? Is there?
Right.
Hang on. Let's try again.
Is that video, right?
Yeah.
Can I just...
Yeah, sorry. Oh, that should play it, yeah. Let's just spin it back to the beginning, thanks. Thank you.
Ukraine is a classical mafia state. There is almost no space beyond corruption. It's all filled by corruption.
Qui descrivono omicidi particolarmente cruenti, cioè ho picchiato la testa fino a romperla, l'ho ucciso con molti colpi.
Have you been using London to launder dirty money? It's a true hard.
It's very easy to get dirty money into the UK if you have the right connections.
We are complicit because we are helping them steal public money. We are providing the getaway vehicle. We are providing the safe haven within which they can hide it.
We've become the money laundering capital of the world, and our reputation's been damaged by it.
I've just been knocked over. Someone kicked me in the groin.
Now, the terrorist attacks which occurred a decade ago yesterday, the single greatest outrage in modern history, could not have been prevented and obliged the United States to use practices like waterboarding because there was no alternative. Wrong, or wrong according to an FBI agent who worked at the heart of America's campaign against Al-Qaeda. Ali Soufan was present at the CIA site where top Al-Qaeda suspects were tortured. He argues that former officials have not been telling the truth about the effectiveness of practices like waterboarding or about whether 9/11 itself could have been forestalled. Soufan has given his only British interview to Gordon Ferrera.
Stepping out of the shadows, appearing for the first time on camera, Ali Soufan, the former FBI agent, with an eyewitness account some people don't want him to tell.
They are trying to stop me and others from telling the world what really happened over there.
He believes huge mistakes were made with devastating consequences.
9/11 happened because we failed to prevent it from happening. We're looking for them overseas. They were here. People in our government knew that they were here.
And 3 men have been found guilty of conspiring to murder hundreds of people in suicide bombings.
The men have been recruited in 2006 by the ringleader of a plot to explode liquid bombs on transatlantic airliners.
Our Home Affairs reporter is Steve Swan. But just remind us of the scale of this plot.
Well, as you say, it was a massive plot. These men were arrested nearly 4 years ago as part of a police investigation into an audacious terrorist plot to smuggle liquid explosives hidden in fizzy drinks bottles onto 7 transatlantic airliners, and the plan was that each one would be detonated mid-flight.
Well, with me to discuss this is Steve Swan, who's from our Home Affairs team, who carried out this research. And see, what sort of people are getting drawn into this?
Well, that's the troubling thing, really. It's such a wide cross-section of society. There isn't a sort of a narrow profile for a typical convicted terrorist. So the sorts of people that are getting convicted include a hospital director, the son of a police officer, a mother of 6, the mother of a toddler. She took the toddler to so-called Islamic State to try to bring up the child in this caliphate, and then realised that she'd made some terrible mistake, came back and was prosecuted. You've got people who are quite educated, people who are undereducated, people who've got a track record of being involved in petty crime, and then other people who have sort of a clean record, and then also growing numbers of women.
Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, accused of planning 9/11, detained by the CIA and forced to talk.
We did not think it made sense to let the terrorists answer questions in their own good time.
We have put together the most complete picture yet of how the CIA extracted confessions from high-value terrorist suspects and went to elaborate lengths to cover its tracks.
They were subject to very intense torture during interrogation, including, as far as we understand, waterboarding.
Human rights officials are now certain that Mohammed was waterboarded in Europe at this base in Poland, just months before it joined the EU.
It's one of the greatest scenes of the modern Polish democracy.
The CIA set up its secret prisons in emerging Eastern European democracies, eager to please the United States.
Okay, that's it. So just stop that. So that's to kind of give you an idea of the sorts of things that I've worked on. I started 20 years ago working in BBC local radio for the BBC in Luton, actually, for 3 Counties Radio, where I was for a while. I don't know if any of you ever heard of Timmy Mallett. He was a kids TV celebrity in the 1980s. So, but by that stage he was just looking to reinvent himself. So he did a drive time show on BBC 3 Counties Radio. I was his producer, which was probably the most difficult job that I've ever done, because he wasn't really very popular at that when he first started, because he was making the transition from children's TV to adult radio. So we had to fill 3 hours of speech radio. There was no music on the station in those days, and people weren't phoning in. So that was a very, very hard job, which I did for 6 months. Then I worked in regional television for BBC Look East. Then I went to the Today programme at BBC Radio 4, worked there for a while. Was there when the 9/11 attacks happened, so I was deployed to America to cover the reaction to that and to the start on the war on terror. And then I sort of gradually became much more focused on national security and terrorism stories. So I developed a specialism in that. And then in the period between, I've worked for Newsnight. I don't know if people watch the show, the Newsnight, which is a BBC 2, 10:30 after the 10 o'clock news. I've also worked on Panorama. So the first thing that you saw in the film was a panorama which I made earlier this year, which was about money laundering. So we exposed how a Ukrainian crime gang was using London to move dirty money from corruption in Ukraine into the British property market, which is fueling the rise in property prices and is one of the reasons why young people can't afford to get onto the property ladder in places like London, because rich people have so inflated the cost of property. And one of the ways in which that's being done is by very, very lax regulations allowing corrupt money to come into the country. So one of the things that I've tried to do is to expose, firstly, those people that are doing it, and secondly, how rubbish the anti-money laundering regulatory system is in this country, although it is getting a little bit better. And then I've just spent a lot of time in places like the Old Bailey covering trials of terrorists. I also worked on I don't know if people are familiar with the murder of the Black London schoolboy Stephen Lawrence, but finally, after many, many years, 2 men were brought to justice and convicted of his murder. And I was the producer who was in charge of the BBC's news coverage of that trial, which was a very, very big news story when it happened. So I've worked as you saw that I report mostly on radio, do a lot of writing for BBC Online, because nowadays you sort of have to, it's not enough to be specialised just in TV or just in radio or just as an online writer. You kind of have to do everything, really. So it's good to have lots and lots of skills. So sometimes to operate as a second camera crew, if you need to, if you're doing an extended interview, you need a few different shots, different angles. So it's all about sort of trying to have a range of skills, but then also have a specialism as well, which is always quite handy when they start making people redundant if they do. And the BBC sadly has had to do that over the last few years because it's seen as being too expensive. So it's always really, really good to have a range of skills, and I think to have a sort of a degree of specialism if you can. Obviously when you start out that's much less of an option. I've only really gradually acquired that. So that's kind of what I've done. Maybe I'll just throw it over to you guys if you've got any questions. Yeah?
The money laundering story.
Yeah.
Did that put a target on it at all, like from the people who were doing the money laundering? Is that not quite scary?
Yeah, it was quite scary. I mean, we have a lot of support at the BBC, so we have a high-risk team who will assess the level of danger that's placed on the journalist, whether it's too dangerous to do it. There are certain places in the world where if you want to go as a journalist for the BBC, where it's mandatory that you have to do hostile environment training. Ukraine isn't one of those, although the bit that's now separated is. So it wasn't necessary to do that. But in terms of the risk, you have the sort of the physical dangers that you have to decide whether it's worth it. And then the other big danger is the legal risk of what you're doing. So in that story, there was the danger of, if we go to Ukraine, are we going to get beaten up? When we put the program out, are we going to get sued? Is it libelous? Are we sure that it's correct? Have we contacted the people who we are exposing to give them an opportunity to rebut the allegations that we're putting out there? So I think, it is that your question's a good one. But the risks are sort of quite wide. I mean, I think one of the things that journalists mostly fear, if I'm being honest, is that you're wrong. And it's in some way, because the story about money laundering was based on this enormous leak of documents that was known as the Paradise Papers, which was a massive treasure trove of legal documents which laid bare the way that lots and lots of rich and corrupt people are using offshore tax havens to hide their affairs, to hide how they avoid tax, how they potentially are using criminal money. And so when you're looking at this big data breach, you're seeing a very partial view of the world. So you could see certain documents, but there were also things that were missing that you couldn't see. And the big fear is always that you're looking here, and actually there's a really important piece of information over here which you can't see. And so your main fear actually is that you're going to say something that will be libelous and will end up with you in court. But yeah, no, the security fears are, they're not inconsiderable. And you have to make an assessment, is that the sort of thing, the sort of risk that you're prepared to take? Yeah.
When you're doing the high-profile stories like the property one and the former FBI agent, how do you verify their claims? Whether they're saying true?
Yeah, well.
Is there a process to that?
Yeah, there is. So you would, you'd start by trying to understand who is this person. So, for example, in the case of Ali Soufan, who was he was one of the very few Arab FBI agents that the FBI had on 9/11. So America was totally unprepared for the 9/11 attack. Suddenly there's this sort of perceived enemy that they knew nothing about. And so someone like Soufan, who'd only been in the FBI for a few years, but he was an Arabic speaker, and he was someone who understood Al-Qaeda. Suddenly he was moved up the ranks. Because he became really important. So we had to have a look at him, make sure that he was who we thought he was, which is not a difficult thing to do, but you have to do that. And then you'll look at what this person is telling you and try and check it against whatever other pieces of information that you have. So when he was making the point about the American authorities knew that 2 of the 9/11 bombers had been in America, we knew that that was accurate. There'd been an enormous investigation that the American government made after 9/11, where lots and lots of people testified so that they could try to understand what went wrong. So it wasn't just Ali Soufan who was saying that, but we felt that what made it such a great story was because these are people who often lurk in the shadows. You don't hear their stories, maybe once they've retired. But he was so angry about what had happened that the CIA had failed to share any the relevant information with the FBI, that he felt compelled to speak. So as a journalist, what you want to really try to do is find people with that first-hand insider testimony and get to them before anybody else, any other journalists do, and persuade them to try to. So he wasn't. His first interview was to an American news organisation, but because I'd sort of read about him 2 or 3 years before he went on camera and made contact with him, you develop those relationships with people, you keep reminding them who you are, and it helps if you work for a big organisation like the BBC, because whatever anyone might think about the BBC, it certainly isn't a perfect organisation, but it has big impact. So if you want your story to be heard, then the BBC is not a bad place to put it, because it will still get out across, it's got a global audience. So I think he was also selling a book, which always helps. So he had, it's about trying to find something that will persuade someone to talk. Another story I did about Guantanamo Bay actually was with a man who was a lawyer and a prosecutor actually. So he was someone who was sent to Guantanamo Bay to prosecute our high-value detainees, terrorists who were being held there. And he was someone who completely believed that it was right to do it. And when he got there and he saw the conditions and he saw the state of the files that were being used to prosecute the people there, he just thought, this is terrible. I can't do this. And he was a devout Christian. And he felt, this doesn't sit well with my ethical values. And he resigned. And I read about that in an American newspaper, contacted him, gained his trust, and then he agreed to do the interview. So it's about sort of finding those people who've got these stories, knowing that there will be other journalists around the world who are trying to do the same thing, and then trying to persuade them to come to you to do it with you rather than with the other people. And very many times that doesn't work. They'll do whatever they want to do in the end. But if they feel that they can trust you and the organisation that you work for, then sometimes you can succeed where other journalists don't. Quite often you fail, to be honest. Yeah.
How did the opportunity to work at the BBC present itself?
Well, I knew that I wanted to work for the BBC, which was a good, for me, it sort of reduced the options. So I thought, well, how do I do that? Because I used to be, many years ago, I was a teacher and I changed career. And when I was doing I did a 1-year broadcast diploma course at the London College of Printing to retrain. And when I did, part of the thing was to have placements at local radio stations. So I just targeted BBC ones. So I did, I can't remember, maybe 2-3 week stints for the BBC. And then as soon as I finished, I contacted BBC Three Counties, which was one of the, some of the local, the BBC London, and managed to get work fairly quickly at Three Counties Radio. So I think because I was very sort of focused on the BBC, and then just got lucky really. I think I just badgered them, got some work experience. The key thing is just once you get that experience, to make yourself useful. Because BBC local radio actually is a very, very good place to start, because they don't have many resources. Often when people come in, they need you to do all sorts of things. So I very, very quickly tried to make myself useful, got sent out on stories, volunteered ideas, and then quite quickly started to get some shifts. So I was working freelance, but mostly for the BBC. And then it just sort of, once you get the foot in the door, it kind of, got a bit easier after that. Yeah, at the back.
What would you say is the best way to stand out if you want to become a journalist, or in general, say if you're applying for the BBC, how would you say you can stand out?
I wish I could give you an easy answer to that, because that's obviously what it's a crowded field. So you just know that if you're applying for a job, I mean, even if I applied for a job with 20 years of experience, and I recently did and didn't get it, there's there's just massive competition. It's still a very attractive occupation, even though it's shrinking. So it's always going to be very, very difficult if it's just a paper application and it's, sort of your name and your CV against lots of other people. So that's where that kind of, if you get the opportunity to make actual contacts, to go and see people, to try to get yourself some kind of work experience, shifts. It's really, you know, it's not rocket science really. There'll be lots and lots, you know, the BBC managers might receive 1,000 applications and they've got to filter it somehow. But usually the way it works in the BBC is just like anywhere else. If you can get in the door and start to meet people and start to just, you know, do quite lowly work to begin with, but then once they can start to put a face to the name, they can see that you're you know, sort of, you've got all of the attributes. And what are they? I mean, they're sort of, you know, obviously you need intelligence, you need curiosity about the world. That's fundamental. I mean, if you know, you have to be interested in the news, you have to be interested in people, but then you just have to not give no, not accept no as an answer. There's always a workaround. So, you know, it's finding what the way round it. If you can't, if this guest isn't available in half an hour to talk about the subject that you're, you know, the big news of the day, think about who the next best person would be. It's that sort of thing. So rather than just thinking, oh yeah, that's a shame, can't get him, he's, you know, he's not answering his mobile. It's then, well, it's okay, well, I've got 3 other ideas here. Let's just try these. So it's all about attitude, really. Of course, you need all of the other skills as well. You need to understand, you know, the legal system. You need all of those things. But more than anything, what will make you stand out is your attitude. Yeah?
If you want to sort of get into trying to just do some freelance work, or like a the local BBC or whatever, like who do you sort of, do you just sort of contact them out of the blue, or do you, like, what's the procedure?
Yeah, I would find out who the, I mean, you could just just ring the station up and find out who is the, you know, who's the person, who is the head of news, for example, at BBC Three Counties. You know, just call up the reception, just get a name and an email address, and then start from there. And then I think, you know, they'll want, I mean, when you're freelancing, it's a mixture of things. They might want someone who's, you know, to do a shift on helping to set up the breakfast show or the drive time show, or it might be that there's a, you know, another organisation where you're actually pitching an idea to them. Now, obviously, when I was doing that, I was always quite nervous that if you take a really good idea to an organisation that you don't know, they might steal it. Yeah, and to be honest, they might. So you know, that's always quite a tricky one, whether you would want to do that. And if they don't know you from Adam, they might not go for it anyway. So you might have to. It might be that actually what lots and lots of, for example, radio stations need is they need people. They need to fill the rotas. So they may need someone to help set up a show. And so there you don't particularly have to have your great idea. You can hold that for another day. They're just going to want to know, you know, have you got any ideas about how to make a really interesting breakfast show, if it's a news show? So you'd have to you'd have to obviously persuade them that you are the right person. Case of being honest about the world, that there are lots of people still out there who will steal your ideas. It's just the way it is. Yeah, over there.
Yes, like in your graduate career, what stories have had like the biggest impact on you, and like kind of changed your attitude towards like?
Change my attitude? Wow, that's a good question. I mean, you do story as a journalist. You do stories. You do see. I mean, you're not in the front line, but you're just behind the front line. So you do see things, for example, that can be very upsetting. I've spoken to many people whose, you know, I mean, news is always bad, isn't it? There's not really very much good news on television or anywhere really. So it's nearly always some terrible event has occurred. So I met a young man who had his legs blown off after the 7th of July bombings on the London Underground system. And, you know, things like that you never forget. He had missed a series of trains, managed to get on this particular one train, and he was standing opposite the lead bomber, the 7/7 bombings. And he survived, but with severe disabilities. And that was, you know, I met his father. You know, some things haunt you, and for me that was one of the things that's haunted me, really, to see how lives are shattered by these big events, and then you see people at the heart of them. I've interviewed people, very, very courageous people who've taken great risks to speak. You're always very, very conscious of the debt that you have to people. I spoke to a mother of a young boy who'd died fighting for Islamic State in Iraq, and she had no idea that he'd sort of kind of left home one day, didn't reappear, had been radicalized really very, very quickly without her understanding. You know, and to see how his actions had destroyed his family was, again, you know, very upsetting. So yeah, you sort of, but it also this kind of this contact that you have with these people, it's an amazing thing. You know, you sort of, it's a privileged thing that you have as a journalist, and so it's really, really important that you don't make a mess of it. But obviously you can't, I mean, it's a really good question actually, because whatever you do, you can't satisfy everybody. So that's quite a big thing. When you do a big news story, people will see it, even some of the people that you perhaps were filming and interviewing, and they probably won't be entirely happy with it, because there'll always be something. Because when you work for the BBC, you obviously have to try to take an impartial view. It's not a campaigning organisation, so some people will want to lambast and attack an organisation, and it's not really a thing that the BBC can do. So you know, you can never promise people something that you can't deliver to them. So there are sometimes people will think, well, I'm not going to take this story to the BBC because it's not going to be, you know, it's not going to be done in a way that satisfies me, in which case they'll go somewhere else, which is, you know, fine, that's their right to do that. Yep.
Sorry.
That's okay, no.
You mentioned BBC impartiality.
Yeah.
I know it's been, because that has actually been in the news quite a lot with regards to things like climate change.
Yeah.
And how they maybe go too impartial when they present things that aren't facts as with things that are basically incorrect opinions.
Yeah.
It's an equally correct fact. What's your opinion on that?
God, that's another good question. I mean, these things, you know, it's a sort of I'm sure you probably learnt a bit about this idea of impartiality. Is anything really impartial? And it's something that moves. You know, public opinions don't stay fixed. So, you know, organisations like the BBC have to reassess the views that they've taken on things, and that's usually in an organisation like the BBC, which is very, very bureaucratic, is usually tortuous, takes a long time, and often will frustrate the public. So, you know, I think that the BBC has been too slow on things like climate change, and I think it's beginning to accept that. But sometimes it's like any big institution, it moves very, very slowly, and very often it responds to crises. So it's only when something goes catastrophically wrong, or people just really, really start complaining, that it becomes responsive. So I think it's true that there's often. I remember once let me try and remember this. There's a man who used to be England football manager called Sven-Göran Eriksson, Don't know if anyone's heard of him, but he was quite successful. Anyway, by the time he left the England job, the suggestion was he was going to get the Chelsea job. And it all looked like it was going to happen. And I was working one Saturday and I was asked if I'd go down to Stamford Bridge, Chelsea football ground, and interview fans as they arrived to see what they thought about Sven-Göran Eriksson becoming their manager. And so I was there, I spoke to people, I was just there with the camera crew, and every single person I spoke to said, oh, don't want him, don't like him, don't want him. So I was thinking, okay, but I need to find someone who's got something nice to say about Sven-Göran Eriksson. And I carried on, carried on. I was there for about an hour. Usually it would take probably about 20 minutes. You just get about 5, and then you sort of mix them up a bit. I got 22 interviews, and every single one of them said, we don't want this man as our manager. So I took them back to the team back at Television Centre, where we used to be based. And the editor of the programme was getting really, really angry. He said, we can't use this vox pop because they're all against Sven-Göran Eriksson. And I said, well, that's because everybody was. That, I stayed longer to try to find someone. I actually asked if there was someone who got anything nice to say. And so that was probably a good example of where that's kind of false balance. Because if you'd used 2 of the interviewees, 1 for, 1 against, that wouldn't have been an accurate reflection of what people said. So it's one of these things that you have to fight over all of the time and argue over how you draw this balance. There are no easy answers, like with most things. Yeah.
Does your personal interest ever clash with your professional interest? For instance, having to carry out something you don't particularly agree with?
Yeah. Yes, it does. Yeah. And I think less so now, because I think once you've got experience, that sort of stuff, you learn how to get your voice heard. But when you're starting out, yeah, definitely there are things that I've done that I really, really wasn't happy about. Very few at the BBC. That's partly why I wanted to work for what I regard as, for all of its failings, broadly speaking, a fairly ethical organisation. And in many cases, if you're being asked to do something that is really you fundamentally disagree with, then I think it's your right to say what you... Obviously, it's quite difficult to do that if you're starting out. But if you do it in a reasonable way, and you really think that you can't do this thing that you're being asked to do, then I would encourage you to say what it, express your views. But yeah, when I started out, there were things. There's 1 or 2. I won't tell you exactly what it was, but there's one thing I was asked to do, and I was doing some training with the BBC, where I was asked to go out and contact this family who this terrible thing had happened to, and I didn't regard it as being in the public interest. I thought it was too intrusive. So I sat on a park bench for 2 hours, agonising about it, and then I thought, I'm just going to go back and say that they weren't in. And I went back, and I didn't even need to, I'm not joking, they'd forgotten they'd even sent me out. So it didn't come up, but I thought, I can't do this. I didn't join the BBC to do this sort of journalism. But I thought I didn't have the confidence to say that. But then when I got back, somebody else said to me, you should have never been sent out to do that. And so I thought, right, there are other people who think the same way as me. And it was a really good lesson. Yeah.
You said you started out in BBC, like local radio, and then you progressed to doing work with Panorama program and all of that. So my question is, how did you progress to that point, and how long did it take you?
I spent 3 years in local radio. I remember when I first started out, I contacted the World Service. I wanted to work there, and someone said, spend 2 or 3 years in local radio and then come back. So I did the local radio thing for 3 years, bit of regional TV, and then I went to the Today programme. And then I think once you've worked on one of those big network programs and it went okay, then things become easier. But local radio was just a brilliant place to learn because you get to do pretty much everything, reading the news, producing programs, going out, finding stories, getting on air, driving the radio car to live OBs, all of that sort of stuff. It was just great fun. People's career paths, you know, they're all really different. A lot of it was by accident rather than design. You know, some people go straight to, you know, to a national program, but then often, you know, if you do that straight from university, it can often be fairly constrained what you're doing. You're just setting up guests. Whereas in something like local radio, you'd be out and about on the road, doing interviews, learning how to edit material, quite often much more hands-on. And I found that just much more useful, really, because you just learn more skills. Although the stories are obviously not usually as dramatic as the national stories, but you still get to do more, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So how do you go about like filtering the news? Because obviously you have to pick and choose the stories that you air and like write about. So how do you go about that?
I think probably that's the biggest. Someone asked me the other day, how do you filter all of the information that you get, which is basically what you're asking. And I thought, wow, that's a good question. Because it is the big challenge, really, because you get the sources of news now are so much more diverse than they ever used to be. You've got this stuff coming at you up from everywhere. And then it's, whoa, such and such a person's saying this, they're doing this. So, you know, I guess because I'm focused in a specialist area, that's the first filter. But, you know, assuming that taking away my specialism, you got all of this stuff coming out. I think sometimes it's something very, very basic, like is someone saying something that you haven't heard before? Is this, wow, that sounds really, I've not heard that before. And if you're satisfied that that person is legitimate and what they're saying is accurate, that might be a good place to start. Because, you know, that's one of the things about news sometimes, it's very boring, isn't it? Brexit. Feels like it's the same story every day. But then, you know, if you get, someone says something, you think, wow, I'd never thought about that. Then it might be worth, you know, obviously you have to satisfy yourself that this is accurate and that they're, you know, sort of not some crazy. But if you can do those things, then actually that might, if you found it really, really striking and different, try it out on somebody else, like a friend, see what they think. And then it's, well, right, okay, we found this really interesting, we think this is worth, it's worth hearing about. You know, that's a very, very basic filter. But very, very often, you know, if something is news, it ought to be in a way new. Not just, it's just happened, but actually it's got the potential to change how people think about something. You know, that's one filter. You've got a lot of questions.
No,
that's good.
There must be someone else, surely.
Yeah, someone else, yeah.
Someone up the back? Well, Jess has already asked a question. I can't pick on you.
How many people here are hoping to end up in journalism? Okay, so quite a few actually.
People are asking questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What kind of stories does the BBC not allow you to cover, full stop? They must have some kind of like, okay, these are the things that we do not cover, regardless of what happens. So maybe something about the royal family or something like that.
No, they do lots of stories on the royal family. Yeah, no. No, there are. So there'd be certain stories that, well, there'd be certain stories that are maybe deemed to be too difficult to it doesn't mean you wouldn't do them, but like maybe you might not do them for television. So for example, if you've got, I don't know, I'm trying to think of issues about taste. So if it's a sort of horrific sexual abuse story within a family, let's say, then the details might be deemed to be so graphic that you can't do it for television, for example. But obviously, if that story is massively of public interest, and I don't mean that it might just be interesting for people, but actually it raises big issues about the failures of institutions, let's say the police or whatever. So you think, well, we can't just avoid doing this story. There's got to be another way of doing it. So there was a story, I can't remember the full details, but it was about honor killings in an Asian country, can't remember where, which one of the World Service teams did. And none of the people that they spoke to wanted to be identified, but they wanted their stories to be told. So what they did in the end was a big digital production where they used the BBC as illustrator to tell the story. So fortunately they were able to do the story, because it obviously was like, it raised lots and lots of issues, and it was very, very successful. Lots of people saw it and commented on it. But it was one of those where it was really difficult to see how you could get it on TV and indeed even do it. But because people were sort of so determined to do it, they would. That doesn't really answer your question. What stories wouldn't we do? I mean, there's no rule about this. But there may be certain stories that people feel individual editors, because of their own prejudices, might not like doing. So for example, in my field of terrorism, there's always one editor who never really liked to do terrorism stories. And it was more to do with her views about what people were interested in, the audience. And that was, you know, she was quite a senior person in the BBC. I sort of respected her view, although I disagreed with it. And then she eventually moved on and is doing something else now. But there was a period where the stories that I was doing didn't end up on her programmes, because she didn't appear to be that interested. So you'll encounter that sort of thing, people's prejudices, their interests. But definitely the royal family. The BBC is obsessed with the royal family. Any other questions?
Unfortunately, we've ran out of time, Steve.
That's okay.
Which is a shame, because I had a great question about how the modern journalist protects their contacts from social media and other apps that take them off your phone. But that's for another time. All that remains is for us to give a big round of applause. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.